What's up, YouTube? What's up, squad? We back at it. We got another Mr. Ballin video. This one he just uploaded today. So I'm gonna react to it. You know what I'm saying? I never actually reacted to the ones that he upload on every Sunday. So I'm gonna react to this one. This one, they never saw it coming. Top 3 strange but true. Sounds mysterious and also sound kind of interesting. Let's get into it though. I hope y'all having a good day. I hope y'all taking care of y'all. That's it. Let's get into it.
Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and today we're going to look at 3 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please move in next door to the like button, and then buy a small dog with emphysema who barks 24/7 and leave it outside every night. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One morning in early June of 2011, in the Russian city of Kazan, a 49-year-old Russian woman named Fagiliu Mukametsanov woke up feeling nauseous. Fagiliu had recently had some health problems, and her doctors had told her that she really needed to take it easy, don't do anything that really stressed her out or made her mad, basically just relax. And so, on that morning, this is exactly what Fagiliu decided to do. Instead of pushing through her nausea to go to work anyways that day, she decided she would call out from work and stay home and have some tea and try to just feel better. But a little while later, when Fagiliu was in the kitchen making tea, her husband, Fagili, he came in and asked her how she was doing, and she said, you know what, I actually feel worse. My nausea has gotten worse, my chest hurts, and I'm starting to sweat. I'm gonna go lie down in the bedroom. But as Fagiliu walked across the kitchen to go lay down, her chest suddenly tightened tenfold, and she collapsed to the ground unconscious. Fagili rushed over to her and tried to wake her up, and when he couldn't, he rushed to the phone and dialed 112, which is Russia's emergency line, and he called for an ambulance. And then when the ambulance arrived, Fagiliu was not breathing, and by the time they got her to the hospital, she was declared dead. She had died from a heart attack. Fagili, who had been married to Fagiliu, his wife, for almost 30 years, was absolutely heartbroken, but he and his wife's religion encouraged people to have funerals within 24 hours of a loved one passing away. And so despite the fact that Fagili was basically despondent from all his grief, he pretty much immediately began calling relatives and friends and making preparations.
Yeah, that's crazy, bro. I couldn't do stuff I could not do that.
For Fagiliu's funeral, which would take place the next day. The next morning, Fagili woke up and put on his best suit, and then he joined his and his wife's family and friends at the funeral home for Fagiliu's funeral. When Fagili walked inside of the funeral home, he saw there were all...
Man, I'd be scared of going to funerals. I don't know, it's just me. It probably sound crazy, but I never actually been to nobody's funeral, to a funeral before. I never actually been. I don't think I would want to go either. Like, I'm being honest, I don't want to see a loved one. But I know a loved one in a casket finna be buried 6 feet under in the ground. That's I'm scared, bro.
All these wooden chairs facing forward towards the front of the room, and at the front of the room, up on a table, was his wife's coffin, which was open and surrounded by all the flowers that Fagili had barely been able to buy with the little bit of money that he and his wife had. Fagili slowly made his way down the middle of the room to his wife's coffin, and the other people that were there saw him coming and got out of the way in respect to, the husband of the deceased. And so Fagili, he walks up and he looks down at his wife, who again, it's open casket so we can see her, and he was struck by her appearance. She just did not look right. Now, Fagili did not have enough money to embalm his wife, which means to preserve a dead body and make it look like it's very lifelike. And so instead, the people who worked in this funeral home had just applied heavy makeup to Fagiliu's face to try to make her appear more lifelike, but it really hadn't worked. To Fagili, it didn't even look like his wife. After all, Fagiliu never even wore makeup, and so to see her with heavy eyeliner and bright red lipstick was just totally bizarre. Behind Fagili was Fagili's family and Fagiliu's relatives all assembled in the first row, and they were beginning their prayers for the dead. And so Fagili, he took a few more looks at his wife, and then he stepped back and joined the first row. And so as Fagili was standing there holding his mother's and brother's hand, he closed his eyes and did his best to focus on the words of the prayer, instead of on the grief he was feeling for his wife. And as he was doing that, his mother, who was on his right side, suddenly broke from the words of the prayer and let out this strange crying sound. And Fagili, he opened his eyes and looked over at his mother, expecting her to be collapsed on the ground from all the grief she was experiencing. But instead, he saw his mother was trembling and looking straight ahead. And so Fagili followed her gaze, and what he saw at the front of the room made Fagili want to faint. His wife, Fagiliu, was now sitting straight up in her coffin. She wasn't making a sound, but she was looking out at the crowd of people with her strange makeup on her face, just staring at them with wide eyes. And for a second, everybody in the funeral home noticed this and went totally quiet, and both Fagiliu and the mourners just stared at each other. And then Fagiliu began screaming, but at first it was like she couldn't make any sound, and it was this raspy, dry yell that was coming out of her mouth. But then it built and built until it was sort of like a bellow or a roar. And when this loud, deep, guttural sound began coming out of Fagiliu's mouth, the mourners in the room began screaming too. And suddenly,
The hell happened? I guess some people have some type of spirit and possessed all of them. Start making them scream. That's what happens when you... I don't even know.
it was absolute chaos inside of this building. As funeral workers rushed to call emergency services, not knowing what else to do, Fagili, who also had been screaming after seeing his wife arise from the dead, he kind of snapped out of it and ran to his wife, and he embraced her, and when he did, Fagiliu went from screaming to silent, and she looked up at her husband with wide, scared eyes and began crying, and then she slumped forward into Fagili's arms. At this point, Fagili's family and Fagiliu's family saw what was happening, and they kind of snapped out of it too, and they rushed forward, and they helped Fagili lift Fagiliu out of her coffin.
So she wasn't really dead. So who did the autopsy? Was it an autopsy? She was at the morgue though, so who cut her open? That's a big lawsuit. That's crazy. Now, what if they took organs out of her body? That's a big lawsuit.
And they laid her down on the ground. And even though she wasn't moving, her eyes were open and she was looking up at her family, just absolutely terrified.
Yeah, because of what happened to her. She wasn't even dead. Somebody pronounced her dead for no reason. That's a lawsuit. I would have sued the hospital, and I would have sued the mortuary. Whatever it's called.
With all her makeup running from her tears.
The morgue.
Yeah. And then 12 minutes later, when Fagiliu finally was rushed to the hospital, she was declared dead again. It would turn out that when Fagiliu collapsed on her kitchen floor, she really did have a heart attack, but it didn't kill her. She was just unconscious, and her breathing was very shallow, and she wasn't moving, and nobody noticed. And so when Fagiliu kind of came to and woke up inside of her coffin at her funeral, she likely was okay, all things considered. She was, healthy enough to be alive. But when she looked around the room and saw she was at her own funeral and sitting in her coffin, the stress of that moment had given her another heart attack. And this one had been fatal.
It's crazy.
Today's video is sponsored by NordVPN. Have you ever sat down to watch 1 episode of a show and then you black out and wake up 9 came
Y'all
out,
go
me and
support
Lung had to watch it
NordVPN
in
and go watch the
Pitcairn
video.
Island. And so
Make
we
sure y'all like
to our
too.
Pitcairn hotel, and we're getting ready to. We hadn't just got
Let me
NordVPN.
show
With
y'all. Make
NordVPN's
sure y'all like the
worldwide
video.
access, you can enjoy instant,
It
secure
don't hurt, it's
access
free.
to hundreds of streaming websites worldwide. All NordVPN guarantee. Again, that's NordVPN.com. On October 15th, 2003, a newlywed couple named Tina and Gabe Watson arrived in Australia for their honeymoon. They were both 26 years old and lived in Alabama, and neither of them made very much money. Tina worked in the kids department of a clothing store, and Gabe worked for his father at a packaging company. But Gabe's family had gifted this honeymoon trip to Australia to Gabe and Tina, and so the couple was so excited about it, and they had taken actually a whole year to plan this trip out. It was going to be the adventure of their lives. Once in Australia, the couple spent the first week in Sydney, which is one of the biggest cities in the country. They went on a river cruise, they visited the famous Sydney Opera House, and they went to see the koalas at the zoo, something Tina was very intent on doing because she loved animals. And then, on October 21st, so 6 days into their big trip, the couple headed north to the city of Townsville, which is this beautiful beach town that's right near the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef is the world's largest and most famous coral reef system. This was going to be the real highlight of their trip. Gabe had grown up loving the water, and now, as an adult, his passion was scuba diving. He was a trained rescue diver, and any chance he got back home in Alabama, he would go diving. As for Tina, scuba diving kind of scared her. She didn't like the idea of being underwater for extended periods of time and...
Hey, that's me. I love being underwater. You know what's crazy? What they like to say, it's an old saying that black people can't swim that good. Black people, they too scared to get in the water and all that. I was never that. I got pushed in what? I got pushed in a 9-foot pool as a little kid. How old was I? I was young, but I got pushed in the pool. I was scared at first, but then I calmed down. And after that, it was up from there. I've been swimming ever since. I would rather take my chances in the ocean than go skydiving. I promise that. What happened if the parachute don't work? What happened if the backup parachute don't work? And what happened if you got a diving instructor that don't even know that don't even do it well, or he's not really certified to be a diving instructor, a skydiving instructor? I'd rather take my chances with the water than in the sky.
breathing in underwater. It just felt so foreign that she didn't like it. But she knew Gabe really wanted her to go scuba diving with him in Australia, and so 10 months earlier, in January of 2003, Tina had begun taking scuba diving lessons, and then right before they headed out for this trip to Australia, Tina had gotten certified in scuba diving. So, after arriving in Townsville, Gabe and Tina would spend the night in a hotel, and then early the next morning, the couple would get up and make their way down to the dock where they would board a diving boat. This boat was going to take them out into the open water, right over this famous shipwreck called the Yongola, where lots of people scuba dive, and this Yongola wreck is right near the Great Barrier Reef. So it's a truly amazing place to go scuba diving. When the couple actually was out on the open water, they looked around and just could not believe how stunning everything really was. The beach town at a distance was unbelievable, and the water was perfectly clear blue, where they could see thousands of fish shimmering and swimming all around them. Finally, the dive boat came to a stop over the area where the Yongola wreck was, and Gabe and Tina began putting on their dive gear, as did the other 4 tourists who were also on this diving trip. Now, Gabe and Tina were dive partners, which meant for this dive, they were instructed not to leave each other really at any point until they're back on the surface. But initially, once they and the other divers were put into the water, the entire group swam down together 100 feet to the bottom of the ocean where this shipwreck was. And at first, everything was going great. The swim down was easy, and then once they got down there, because the water was so clear and sunlight could reach them, they were able to look at each other and just really take in how spectacular this really was. But unfortunately, Gabe, he looked at his wrist at some point and noticed his dive computer, which tells you how much air you have left and what depth you're at, was malfunctioning, and so he signaled to Tina that he needed to go to the surface and get his computer fixed. And so he and Tina would swim away from the group back up to the surface, and then once on the surface, Gabe was able to talk to the dive leader on the boat, and he was able to get his dive computer fixed. And then after only a couple of minutes of being back on the surface, Gabe and Tina went back under the water and began heading back down towards the rest of the group. And as Gabe and Tina approached the rest of the group, they saw they were all kind of swimming around in dive pairs around the Yongola wreck. And so Gabe and Tina, they got down there and they joined the queue and began as well moving as a pair around the wreck. Back up on the surface, the dive leader, who was up in the boat, was just kind of sitting there waiting for the divers to come back up, when all of a sudden he noticed there was this sudden eruption of air bubbles coming up to the surface. And so he peered over the side of the boat to see what was going on, and Gabe, who had only left the surface after fixing his dive computer maybe 5 minutes earlier, came bombing up out of the water. And when he did, the dive leader immediately noticed that Tina was not with him. And before the dive leader could even...
Something must have happened to her.
Ask
Crazy,
Gabe.
Bro. That's what I would have been, bro. That's why I low-key, I don't... Now when I said I don't want to... I would take my chance in the water over skydiving, I would not want to do this either. I just contradicted myself in my own video. That's crazy, but... Hey, don't y'all ever get that feeling like you know you ain't supposed to be doing this, but you want to do it, but in the back of your mind, you also saying, I don't want to do it. Hey.
What was going on?
Like that.
Gabe, who was obviously very panicked, he ripped off his mask and he began trying to tell the dive leader that something was wrong with his wife, that she had sunk away from him and he couldn't get to her and he needed help. And so the dive leader immediately put on a scuba tank, he jumped in the water and swam down as fast as he could to the wreck down below. And when he got there, he immediately saw Tina by herself laying on the sand on the bottom of the ocean, just totally motionless on her back. And so
what happened to her? Did she lose air? Like her oxygen tank wasn't full? She must have been sucking in all that air and the oxygen tank just gave out.
Dive leader, he
R.I.P.
swam over to her, he scooped her up, and he brought her all the way back to the surface. And then once on the surface, he put Tina into the boat, and then the dive leader, he climbed inside and immediately began doing CPR on Tina. And for 45 minutes, the dive leader tried to do CPR, tried everything he could to save Tina, but unfortunately it was not enough, and Tina passed away. An autopsy would later reveal that Tina had died from something called an air embolism, which is when an air bubble gets trapped in a blood vessel and blocks it. In scuba divers, this can happen from holding your breath for too long or trying to ascend too quickly. One theory about how this could have happened to Tina was based on what Gabe said happened when he and Tina went back down to the wreck after he got his dive computer fixed. He said they got down there, everything was fine, they were swimming around like the other dive pairs, taking pictures, when Tina started to panic, kind of randomly, and she reached out for Gabe, and Gabe said she knocked his oxygen mask off his face, and so Gabe was kind of starting to panic, and he got the mask back on, at which point Tina was kind of floating away from him, and so Gabe, not really knowing what to do, said he went to the surface to get help. And so in that time frame, perhaps Tina, tried to rush to the surface on her own, giving herself the air embolism, or maybe in her panic, she had held her breath, giving herself the air embolism. But it wasn't long after...
If you got breathing masks, you should be able just to breathe fine underwater if you got the breathing tubes and all that. The only thing I don't like is them tubes where you gotta literally be like... One gotta be sticking up out of the water for you to breathe. I don't like that. Give me the one with the full mask where I could breathe underwater.
After Tina's death was ruled an accident and the case was closed, that the other 4 people who were on that dive with Gabe and Tina began reaching out to Tina's family. These divers had seen something very strange happen right around the time Tina died, and they felt like they had to tell someone. One of these 4 divers would tell Tina's family that as they were swimming around the wreck, they saw Gabe and Tina come back down after Gabe had fixed his dive computer, and pretty quickly after they reached the bottom, Gabe seemed to give Tina a hug, like a really strong bear hug. Now, there's no reason any diver would hug another diver underwater, certainly not that hard, unless it was some sort of rescue attempt. And this diver who witnessed this told Tina's family that this did not look like a rescue attempt. It looked like Gabe was trying to restrain Tina, and Tina was trying to get away from Gabe. After a few moments of watching...
That is crazy, bro. That is sick, bro. I had a feeling, bro. I literally had a feeling, but I didn't want to say that. But I had a feeling. Dang. Your own husband did that to you. Because I literally had that in my mind. Why would he literally just sit there and let you sink? He panicked and went up to the surface and just left you there, knowing you panicking and you can't breathe. That's an ill husband.
Watching this, the same diver
dude should be in jail too.
Would see Gabe release Tina, and at that point Tina would go limp and float to the bottom, and Gabe would
I had a feeling, bro. I really did.
Rush to the surface, where he would tell the dive leader that he had this emergency with his wife. This new information led Australian authorities to charge Gabe with murder. They alleged that Gabe intentionally turned off Tina's air and then put her in that bear hug to make sure she couldn't turn it back on again. Gabe, however, has always denied this, saying his wife really just panicked and he was trying to help her but couldn't and then went to the surface. Gabe ultimately pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter in Australia and served 18 months in prison. Prosecutors in Alabama then also tried to charge Gabe with murder or something else in connection to Tina's death, but ultimately a judge dismissed the case.
So he only got 18 months. Bro, that don't make no sense. It really don't. 18 months for killing his wife. That's crazy, bro. But you could look at how many other people is in jail right now for something that's not dealing with murder. Just over something stupid or over something little. But this dude get away. He gets out. He gets released after 18 months. Must be nice, bro. It must be nice to do some shit like that and get away with it.
One final note about this story, which also happens to be the reason most people know about this story, is that 2 of the 4 divers who were down there with Gabe and Tina were taking underwater pictures at the time that Tina died. Here is a photo they developed from this trip, which clearly shows Tina in the background just moments after Gabe had released her and she sunk to the bottom and died.
Yeah, dude's a sick individual.
In July of 1848, a 25-year-old man named Phineas Gage got a job working construction on the Hudson River Railroad in New York. At this time in America, railroads were being laid all over the country, and so lots of workers like Phineas were needed to blast rock out of the way to lay down these railroad tracks. And as it happened, Phineas was an expert in explosives. He had learned how to set controlled blasts growing up on his family's farm in New Hampshire, and then later in his life he had worked in a mine blasting through rock. And so in addition to just being the ideal railroad worker for this time in America, when Phineas actually started working in New York on this railroad, his co-workers immediately started looking up to him. Phineas was extremely smart and energetic. He was this incredible conversationalist. He was charismatic and funny and a natural leader. And so just 2 months into starting this new job, it was no surprise to anyone who knew Phineas or worked with Phineas that he was promoted to blasting foreman, which meant Phineas would lead the explosives team. Phineas was so excited about this promotion that he went to a blacksmith and had a custom tamping iron made. A tamping iron is a long metal rod that's used to pack explosives. When railroad workers wanted to blast through, let's say, a big rock, they would start by drilling a deep but skinny hole in the rock. Then they would pour blasting powder inside, then they'd put a fuse inside, and then using this tamping iron, they would push the blasting powder and the fuse deep into this hole inside of this rock or whatever it was they were blowing up. And then, once it was packed, they would ignite it. Usually, tamping irons were sort of rough tools that looked like crowbars, but Phineas really wanted something special to commemorate this promotion. And so Phineas had the blacksmith make this perfectly straight, smooth, 4-foot-long metal tamping iron, and on one end was a pointed side, and on the other was a blunted side. And this rod, it weighed about 13 pounds, and it was about 1.25 inches in diameter. And Phineas loved this tamping iron. He brought it with him not just to work, but basically anywhere he went. On September 3rd, 1848, so not long after Phineas's big promotion, Phineas and his explosives team were blasting through some rock that ran through a forest. And Phineas, he was right up front over the blasting site, helping them prep the explosive. His team had drilled that long, deep, skinny hole into the rock they were about to blow up, and then blasting powder was put inside, a fuse was put inside, and then Phineas took his tamping iron and began packing the powder and fuse deep into the rock. And the way he did this is he used the blunt end of his tamping iron to pack the explosives, which meant the pointed end was sticking out of the rock. And so as Phineas is doing this, someone behind him slipped on a rock. One of his men tripped or something, and so Phineas, with his hands kind of on his tamping iron, turned to the right to look and see.
He gonna be fine. He just hurt. He gonna be alright though.
And when he did this, somehow his tamping iron that was inside of this skinny hole must have nudged against the inside of the rock, created a spark, and ignited the explosive inside of the rock, which meant the tamping iron was basically fired like a missile out of this hole into Phineas's head. It went in his cheek, up behind his left eye, up and out of his skull, and then shot 80 feet away, landing on the ground, covered in Phineas's blood and brains. This happened so quickly that for a second after this thing has blown through Phineas's head, Phineas just stood there upright with his eyes wide, and then suddenly a geyser of blood began shooting out of the top of his head, and then Phineas fell backwards onto the ground. When Phineas's body hit the ground, he began having a seizure, at which point his co-workers, who were still kind of shaken up from this sudden blast, they rushed over and tried to kind of position him in a way that he wouldn't hurt himself. But I mean, they're looking at him, and he's literally missing half of his head.
That's what I'm saying. I don't even think he cares about being hurt no more. This dude literally just got his head exploded open. He ain't feeling none of that other hurt. That hurt is in the head now.
He's covered in blood, and they're thinking, there's nothing we could do for him but basically wait for him to die. And so all of Phineas's co-workers, who adored Phineas, just stood there very somber watching their boss die. But eventually, Phineas stopped having a seizure, and then he opened his eyes, and he looked up at his crew, and he sat up, and he said, "What happened?" Now remember, half of his head has been blown out by a 13-pound, 4-foot-long metal rod that has shot through his head. And his co-workers, when they heard how clearly he was speaking and how focused his eyes were, they couldn't believe it. How?
I would not think that dude was human. I'm keeping it real. I would not have thought that dude was human, bro.
In the world is this guy alive, let alone having a coherent conversation with them? And so the co-workers told Phineas, "Please lie down, we'll get you help, lie down, relax." But Phineas, who still had blood also shooting out of his head, just kind of stood up casually and walked over to the railroad cart and signaled for his crew to take him back into town. And so the crew, they're looking over at Phineas, who now is literally head to toe just red from blood. Still bleeding, but less so, and he's just sitting on the railroad cart waiting for them. And so they walk over to him, and they start the slow 1-mile journey into town on this railroad cart. And the whole time, they're all kind of looking at Phineas, expecting him to die any second. But instead, Phineas is just kind of looking around with half of his head, and at some point, he pulled out his logbook and carefully wrote down what time they were leaving their work site to make sure his crew was accurately paid. And then finally, they reached town.
So nobody was going to tell him nobody ain't gonna tell him what's wrong with him. That's crazy, bro. Nobody ain't tried to get this dude help. Nobody ain't tried to stop working and get that dude to an emergency room.
And Phineas was still very much alive and looking around, acting like nothing had happened to him. And the co-workers helped him to his hotel. And Phineas just sat outside on a chair in front of his hotel, just people watching, while his crew went and got a doctor. A doctor soon arrived, and he too was completely shocked at Phineas's appearance, but even more so was Phineas's eyes. He looked at the doctor, and his eyes were totally focused, like he was all there, totally lucid, looking at the doctor, waiting for him to come over and help him out with his little injury. And when the doctor kind of timidly approached Phineas, Phineas very famously said as he sat on his chair, "Doctor, here's business enough for you." Like everyone else, the doctor fully assumed that despite Phineas's miraculous recovery from this injury, that he would soon die from this horrific wound in his head. And so the doctor moved Phineas up into the hotel, put him in a bed, and then basically made him comfortable. Now, the doctor at this point was not trying to save Phineas. He felt like there was nothing he could do to save Phineas. At this point, it was like mercy. Let's make this as pain-free as possible for Phineas as he inevitably dies from this injury. But Phineas didn't die. He would break out of it and basically be okay again. However, his personality at first, after he came out of this state of delirium, was not really the same. No longer was he this funny, smart, charming, confident leader. Instead, he was this guy who seemed to have lost all of his inhibitions and was kind of childlike. He swore all the time. He would tell people he had these crazy plans he was going to go do, but he would never follow through with them. And he would tell his nieces and nephews these wild stories about himself that were obviously made up and not even close to reality.
I mean, that's what happened when you get hit in the brain. You get hit in the brain too hard. That's what happens. The thing literally exploded out of his head, so it wouldn't even be surprising if it hit his brain.
But overall, he was okay, even though you could see his brain pulsing underneath his skin on the side of his head that had been blown off. And within a couple of years of this injury, those changes to Phineas's personality kind of faded, and he really did become old Phineas. However, there was one unique quirk to Phineas post-injury that never went away. And that was Phineas's kind of unhealthy love for the tamping iron that had blown through his head. After his injury, Phineas kind of stopped making friends, and any friends he did have, he really didn't try to keep those relationships up. He didn't get married, he didn't have kids. Instead, the tamping iron became sort of like his best friend. He took it everywhere with him, even posing at one point with the tamping iron the way you would expect a couple to pose for a photo. 12 years after his horrific injury, Phineas would develop seizures, likely from the injury, and then he would die with his beloved tamping rod right by his side. His case changed neuroscience forever by showing that an injury to the brain could affect specific personality traits. Today, Phineas's skull and his tamping rod are on display at Harvard Medical School.
Nah, that's disrespectful. You're gonna put this man human remains skull in a museum. I would have been so... I would have hunted that museum so hard. Man, bro. Imagine being a good ghost. I would have been the most menace ghost in the afterlife. I promise that. Hey, but that's the end of the video, y'all. Till next time.